My name is Zara, and I'm 28. Tonight, my parents handed me a birthday cake that read, "Congratulations on another year of being pathetic," while every family member filmed my reaction, waiting for me to break down and cry. Instead, I thanked them for dinner and walked toward the door. But before I left, I said 3 words that made them all start screaming. Where are you watching from today? Drop your location in the comments below and hit that like and subscribe button if you've ever felt completely unwanted by your own family. You'll definitely want to stick around for what happened next. Let me take you back to how I got here, because this story didn't start with a cruel birthday cake. It started 28 years ago when I was born into the Walsh family, where being the family disappointment became my permanent role before I could even walk. Growing up, I learned early that I was different from everyone else in my family. Not special different, mind you, wrong different. While my brother Tommy excelled at baseball and brought home trophies that lined the mantelpiece, I brought home report cards that my parents would glance at and set aside with barely concealed disappointment. While my sister Katie won beauty pageants and filled photo albums with sparkling tiaras, I filled nothing except space at the dinner table. My parents, Linda and Frank Walsh, had very specific ideas about success, and I didn't fit any of their criteria. Tommy was going to be a professional athlete, they declared. Katie was going to marry well and produce beautiful grandchildren. And me? Well, they never really figured out what I was supposed to do, which became increasingly obvious as the years passed. Family gatherings were particularly brutal. Every birthday, holiday, or celebration became an opportunity for my relatives to point out everything I wasn't accomplishing. "Zara's still single," Aunt Margaret would announce to the room as if I weren't standing right there. "Maybe you should try online dating, dear. Lower your standards a bit." Uncle Bob would chime in with helpful observations about my career choices, my apartment, my car, and basically every life decision I'd ever made. The thing is, I wasn't actually failing at life. I had a decent job at a marketing firm, my own apartment, and I'd even managed to save some money. But in the Walsh family, decent wasn't good enough. If you weren't winning trophies, pageants, or landing CEO positions, you were basically invisible. Actually, that's not quite right. Invisible would have been a blessing. Instead, I was hyper-visible as the family's walking cautionary tale. Every conversation eventually circled back to what I should be doing differently, what I was doing wrong, or how I could learn from Tommy and Katie's obviously superior life choices. Family dinners became master classes in passive-aggressive criticism disguised as concern. "We just want what's best for you," became their favorite phrase, usually followed by detailed explanations of why everything I'd chosen was obviously not what's best for me. My job wasn't prestigious enough. My apartment was too small and in the wrong neighborhood. My boyfriends were never good enough, though they made sure to point out that I should be grateful anyone was interested at all. The worst part wasn't even the direct criticism. It was the complete absence of genuine interest in my life. When Tommy scored a touchdown, the whole family would relive the moment for weeks. When Katie got a modeling gig, my mother would call every relative to share the news. When I got promoted at work, my father asked if they were sure they'd chosen the right person. But here's the thing about being treated like the family disappointment for 3 decades. You start to develop certain skills. You become very good at observing people, at noticing things they think they're hiding. You learn to listen carefully to what people say and what they don't say. And most importantly, you learn to protect yourself. So when my parents called last week with their sudden invitation to a special birthday dinner, after years of barely acknowledging my birthday existed, every instinct I'd developed over 3 decades started screaming that something was wrong. The phone call came on a Tuesday afternoon while I was finishing a client presentation. My mother's voice had that artificially sweet tone she only used when she wanted something or when she was about to deliver particularly devastating news disguised as kindness. "Zara, honey," she began, and I immediately knew this was going to be interesting. My mother hadn't called me honey since I was 7 years old. "Your father and I were talking, and we realized we've been absolutely terrible about celebrating your birthday properly." I stared at my computer screen, wondering if I was having some kind of stress-induced hallucination. In 28 years, my parents had never once expressed regret about how they'd handled my birthday. Their track record spoke for itself. Forgotten dates until someone reminded them, half-hearted celebrations that felt more like obligations than genuine gestures, and gifts that somehow always managed to feel like criticism. "Oh," I said, "because what exactly do you say when your parents suddenly pretend to care about something they've ignored for decades?" "We want to make it up to you," she continued, her voice bubbling with enthusiasm that sounded about as genuine as a politician's campaign promise. "We're going to throw you a real birthday party, a special dinner with the whole family. Everyone's going to be there. Everyone." That was definitely not a selling point. Everyone in my family being in the same room usually meant I was about to become the evening's entertainment, whether I wanted to or not. Mom, that's really not necessary, I started. But she cut me off. Nonsense. We insist. It's the least we can do for our daughter. Saturday night, 7 o'clock, wear something nice. She paused, and I could practically hear her thinking, maybe that blue dress you wore to Katie's engagement party. You looked almost pretty in that one. And there it was. Even when trying to do something nice for me, my mother couldn't help herself. Almost pretty. Because God forbid she give me a compliment that didn't come with a qualifier. I'll think about it, I said, which was my standard response to family invitations I had no intention of accepting. Oh, you'll be there, my father's voice said in the background. He'd been listening to the whole conversation, apparently. We've already invited everyone. Don't make us look bad. Don't make us look bad. That was rich, coming from people who'd spent 3 decades making me look bad at every possible opportunity. After I hung up, I sat at my desk trying to figure out what game they were playing. My parents didn't suddenly develop parental feelings overnight. They didn't wake up one morning and decide they'd been treating me poorly. And they definitely didn't throw parties for people they considered family disappointments. Something was wrong with this picture, but I couldn't figure out what it was. Maybe they wanted to announce that Tommy was getting married or that Katie was pregnant. Maybe they needed me there to help pay for something, since I was the only one in the family with actual savings. Or maybe this was some elaborate setup for another round of public humiliation disguised as family bonding. The more I thought about it, the more convinced I became that this dinner was a trap. But here's the thing about being the family scapegoat for 3 decades. You develop a certain morbid curiosity about exactly how far people will go. You want to see what new level of cruelty they can devise, partly because you can't quite believe it's real, and partly because you need to know what you're dealing with. So despite every rational instinct telling me to stay home, I found myself planning to attend this mysterious birthday dinner, not because I expected anything good to come from it, and certainly not because I believed my parents had suddenly developed genuine affection for me. I was going because I wanted to see what they were really up to, and because, honestly, I was tired of running away from situations that were going to be awful, regardless of whether I showed up or not. If they were planning to humiliate me again, fine. At least this time I'd be prepared for it. At least this time I wouldn't be surprised when the people who were supposed to love me decided to treat me like their personal entertainment. What I didn't realize was that being prepared for humiliation and being prepared for what they actually had planned were 2 completely different things. Saturday arrived with the kind of gray November weather that makes everything feel slightly ominous. I spent most of the day trying to talk myself out of going, then trying to talk myself into going, then wondering why I was even debating something that was clearly going to be a disaster, regardless of what I decided. But curiosity won, the way it always does when you've been raised by people who specialize in psychological warfare disguised as family traditions. I chose my outfit carefully. Not the blue dress my mother had suggested, because I wasn't about to take wardrobe advice from someone who'd just called me almost pretty. Instead, I picked a black dress that made me feel confident and a pair of heels that would let me make a dramatic exit if necessary. Because if this evening was going to be a performance, I might as well look good for my exit scene. The restaurant they'd chosen was Luigi's, a mid-range Italian place where my family had celebrated every major occasion for the past 15 years. Not because the food was particularly good, but because my father knew the owner and liked to pretend he was important enough to get special treatment. The kind of place where the lighting was dim enough to hide disappointment, and the wine was cheap enough that my parents could afford to get everyone drunk. I arrived exactly on time, because punctuality was one of the few things my parents had managed to teach me that was actually useful. The hostess led me to a large round table in the back corner, where my extended family was already gathered like vultures circling something that wasn't quite dead yet. My parents, Linda and Frank, sat at what they clearly considered the head of the table, wearing matching expressions of barely contained excitement that made my stomach clench. Tommy and his wife Sarah flanked them on one side, while Katie and her fiancé Derek occupied the other side. Uncle Bob and Aunt Margaret had claimed the seats with the best view of whatever was about to happen, and my cousins filled in the remaining spaces. Everyone looked up when I approached, and there was something in their expressions that confirmed every instinct I'd had about this dinner. They looked like people who were in on a joke that was about to be revealed. They looked like people who were about to enjoy themselves at someone else's expense. "Zara!" my mother called out, her voice pitched just a little too high. "You made it! We were starting to worry you'd changed your mind." I settled into the only remaining chair, which had obviously been positioned to give everyone else the perfect view of whatever reaction they were expecting from me. Have you ever felt like you're walking into a trap but decided to spring it anyway just to see what happens? Drop a comment below if you've ever been there. The conversation during dinner was aggressively normal, which was somehow more unnerving than if they'd just been openly hostile. Everyone asked about my job, my apartment, my dating life. all with the kind of intense interest my family had never shown before. It felt like being interviewed by people who already knew they weren't going to hire you but wanted to document all the reasons why. Tommy regaled us with stories about his latest promotion. Katie showed off her engagement ring for the 15th time and discussed wedding plans that sounded like they cost more than most people's houses. My parents basked in their children's successes like plants absorbing sunlight, while I sat there wondering when the other shoe was going to drop. Because it was definitely going to drop. The artificial cheerfulness, the overly attentive questions, the way everyone kept checking their phones and exchanging glances when they thought I wasn't looking, it all pointed to something planned, something that required an audience and documentation. About halfway through dinner, I started noticing subtle signs that something was planned. Katie kept glancing at her phone, which was positioned at an odd angle near her water glass. Tommy had his phone beside his plate, and I caught him tapping the screen when he thought I wasn't looking. Even Uncle Bob kept fidgeting with his phone in a way that seemed unnatural for him. The realization hit me gradually. They were preparing to record whatever was coming next. That's when I realized this wasn't just going to be another round of casual humiliation disguised as family bonding. This was going to be something bigger, something they wanted to preserve and probably share. Something they thought was going to be so entertaining that they needed to document it. I excused myself to go to the bathroom, partly because I needed a moment to think, and partly because I wanted to see how they reacted when I left the table. Sure enough, the moment I stood up, I saw several of them lean forward in hushed conversation. Whatever they had planned, they were discussing last-minute details. In the bathroom mirror, I studied my own reflection and tried to prepare myself for whatever was coming. 28 years of being this family's designated victim should have prepared me for anything, but something about tonight felt different. Bigger, more deliberate. When I returned to the table, the atmosphere had shifted again. Everyone was practically vibrating with anticipation, like children waiting for Christmas morning. My mother kept checking her watch, my father kept clearing his throat, and the phones had somehow become even more obviously positioned. "Well," my mother announced as the waiter cleared our dinner plates, "I think it's time for dessert." And that's when I knew. Whatever they had planned, it was about to happen. The waiter disappeared into the kitchen with instructions I couldn't quite hear, though from the way my family members were all suddenly sitting up straighter and reaching for their phones, I knew the main event was about to begin. My mother was practically bouncing in her seat with excitement that she wasn't even trying to hide anymore. My father had that smug expression he always got when he thought he was about to be particularly clever. Around the table, everyone else looked like an audience settling in for a show they'd been eagerly anticipating. "You know, Zara," my mother said, her voice taking on that artificially sweet tone that I now realized had been her warm-up act. "We really have been thinking about how we've handled your birthdays over the years." "Have you?" I asked, genuinely curious about where this was going. "Oh yes," she continued, glancing around the table for support from her co-conspirators. "And we realized that maybe we haven't been quite honest enough with you." Honest. That was an interesting word choice coming from people who'd spent the last 2 hours pretending to care about my life for the first time in decades. "We've decided that this year, we want to give you something really meaningful," my father chimed in. "Something that really reflects who you are and what you mean to this family." The way he said meaningful made my skin crawl. In my family, meaningful usually meant deliberately cruel but disguised as concern or humor. It meant whatever was coming next was going to hurt, but I'd be expected to smile and act grateful for it. Katie leaned forward, her phone now clearly in recording position. "We put a lot of thought into this, Zara. We really wanted it to be special." Special. Right. The same way my family had always made me feel special. Which was to say, like a circus performer whose only job was to entertain everyone else with my reactions to whatever they threw at me. That's when the waiter returned, carrying a cake that made the entire table erupt in barely contained giggles. It was a standard sheet cake with white frosting. Nothing fancy. But it was what was written on it that made everyone start reaching for their phones to capture my reaction. In bright blue frosting letters, the cake read, "Congratulations on another year of being pathetic." The silence that followed was the kind of absolute quiet that only happens when an entire room full of people is holding their breath, waiting to see how someone will react to being publicly humiliated. Every phone at the table was now actively recording. Every face was focused on me with the intensity of people watching a car accident happen in slow motion. For just a moment, I felt exactly what they wanted me to feel. That familiar rush of humiliation and hurt that had been my constant companion throughout childhood. The crushing weight of being reduced to entertainment for people who were supposed to love me. The bewilderment of trying to understand how the people who brought me into this world could take such obvious pleasure in trying to break me down. But then something else kicked in. Something that had been building for 28 years of moments exactly like this one. a kind of crystalline clarity that made me realize I was done. I was done pretending their cruelty was normal. I was done making excuses for people who had never shown me genuine kindness. I was done being grateful for scraps of attention from people who clearly saw me as nothing more than a source of amusement. Most importantly, I was done reacting the way they expected me to react. Instead of tears, instead of anger, instead of running away or breaking down, I felt something I'd never felt before in one of these situations. I felt calm, completely, utterly calm. "Thank you," I said, looking directly at my mother. "This is exactly what I would expect from you." The confusion on their faces was immediate. This wasn't the script they'd prepared for. They'd expected tears, or anger, or some kind of dramatic breakdown they could film, and probably share with their friends later. They'd expected me to play my assigned role as the family victim. "It's just a joke, honey," my father said quickly, probably realizing that my calm response wasn't what they'd been hoping for. "You know how we like to tease." "Oh, I know exactly how you like to tease," I replied, standing up from my chair. "You've been showing me for 28 years. I picked up my purse, smiled at the table full of people who were still holding their phones like they weren't sure whether to keep recording or not, and headed for the door. But I wasn't done yet. Not even close. Because for the first time in my life, I wasn't walking away as the victim of this family's cruelty. I was walking away as someone who had finally figured out how to turn the tables. I made it exactly 3 steps from the table before I stopped and turned back around. Every instinct I'd developed over 3 decades of being this family's punching bag told me to keep walking, to get out of there before they could inflict any more damage, to go home and pretend this had never happened. But for the first time in my life, I wasn't listening to those instincts. Instead, I was listening to a voice that had been getting stronger every day for the past few years. The voice that reminded me I was a grown woman with my own life, my own job, my own money, and my own choices. The voice that was tired of letting these people define my worth based on their own limitations. The voice that was absolutely done with being anyone's victim. "You know what?" I said, my voice carrying clearly across the restaurant as I turned back to face the table full of people who were still holding their phones, still recording, still waiting for the breakdown they'd been expecting. "I want to say something." My mother's face lit up with anticipation. This was probably what she'd been hoping for all along, some kind of dramatic scene she could describe to her friends for weeks afterward, some confirmation that their assessment of me as pathetic was accurate. "I want to thank all of you," I continued, walking back toward the table but not sitting down. "Really, this has been incredibly enlightening." The confusion on their faces was beautiful. They'd expected tears or anger or some kind of emotional explosion they could later dismiss as me being too sensitive or unable to take a joke. They hadn't prepared for gratitude. "For 28 years, you've all shown me exactly who you are," I said, looking around the table and making eye contact with each person who was still recording. "You've shown me that you're the kind of people who get together to plan ways to hurt someone you claim to love. You've shown me that you find entertainment in someone else's pain. You've shown me that you're the kind of people who film cruelty and call it family bonding." My father started to interrupt, but I held up my hand. "I'm not finished," I said, and something in my tone made him close his mouth. "You've also shown me that you're the kind of people who mistake kindness for weakness, who mistake someone's willingness to keep showing up for family as permission to treat them however you want." I could see them starting to get uncomfortable now. This wasn't going according to their script. They'd planned to humiliate me, not receive a lecture about their behavior. "But here's what you didn't know," I said, and I could see the first flicker of uncertainty cross several faces. "I've been recording tonight, too." The change in the room was immediate and electric. Phones that had been subtly recording suddenly disappeared into purses and pockets. The confident expressions that had been so obvious just moments before shifted into something much more uncertain. The moment I arrived and sensed something was off, I activated a recording app on my phone. I continued, "I've captured your excitement about what you had planned, your obvious pleasure in executing it, and your reactions to my response. Everything from dinner conversation to this exact moment." My mother's face had gone completely white. "Zara, honey, you're overreacting. It was just a joke," I finished for her. "Yes, I heard that part. I recorded that part too." The panic was spreading now. I could see it in their faces, the sudden realization that their little joke might have consequences they hadn't considered. "You wanted to film something tonight?" I said, slipping my phone back into my purse. "Congratulations, you succeeded, but I don't think your performance is going to be quite as entertaining when people see the whole context. When they see a room full of adults planning and executing deliberate cruelty against a family member. When they see how excited you all were to film someone's humiliation." Uncle Bob was the first one to break. "Now, Zara, there's no need to..." "To what?" I asked. To show people who you really are? To let them see what kind of family traditions you enjoy? I turned and walked toward the exit, but this time I made it all the way to the door before I delivered my final line. Before I said the 3 words that would change everything. Oh, and just so you know, I called back to the table full of people who were now sitting in stunned silence. I recorded everything. And then I walked out of Luigi's restaurant, leaving behind 28 years of being the family victim, and 28 years of accepting treatment that no one should ever have to accept from people who claim to love them. But I wasn't done yet, not even close. Because what they didn't know was that walking away was just the beginning. I sat in my car in the parking lot for exactly 10 minutes, watching through the restaurant windows as my family tried to figure out what had just happened. The panic was visible even from a distance. They were clearly having some kind of heated discussion, with lots of gesturing and what appeared to be finger-pointing. My phone started buzzing almost immediately. First text from my mother. Zara, please don't do anything rash. It really was just meant to be funny. Second text from Katie. Why are you being so dramatic? It's not that serious. Third text from Tommy. Come back inside. Let's talk about this like adults. I deleted each message without responding and started my car. I had work to do, and it couldn't wait until tomorrow. Have you ever had a moment where you realized you held all the power but everyone else still thought they were in control? Tell me about it in the comments. The drive home took 20 minutes, during which my phone continued buzzing with increasingly desperate messages from various family members. Each text confirmed what I already knew. They were finally starting to understand that their little joke might have consequences they hadn't anticipated. My apartment had never felt more welcoming than it did when I walked through the door that night. For the first time in years, I felt like I was exactly where I belonged, surrounded by things I'd chosen, in a space that reflected who I actually was, rather than who my family thought I should be. I poured myself a glass of wine, changed into comfortable clothes, and settled at my computer. Because the real work was just beginning. First, I uploaded the recording I'd made to a secure cloud storage account. Then I made several backup copies and saved them to different locations. Whatever happened next, I wanted to make sure the documentation of tonight's events couldn't disappear. Then I opened a new document and started typing. Not an angry rant, not an emotional outburst, but a clear, factual account of what had happened at dinner. The premeditation, the coordination, the filming, the obvious pleasure they'd taken in planning and executing something designed to cause me pain. I wrote about the pattern of behavior that had led to this moment. The years of casual cruelty disguised as family tradition. The way they'd systematically undermined my confidence while building up my siblings. The constant message that I was less valuable, less worthy of respect, less deserving of basic human dignity. I wrote about how they'd trained me to accept this treatment by framing any resistance as me being too sensitive or unable to take a joke. How they'd convinced me that their behavior was normal, that all families functioned this way, that I should be grateful for any attention at all. And I wrote about how that training had finally broken down, not because of tonight's cake, but because of everything that had led up to it. Because 3 decades of being treated as entertainment had finally reached the point where I couldn't pretend it was acceptable anymore. When I finished writing, I read through the document several times, making sure every word was accurate and every emotion was conveyed without unnecessary drama. This wasn't about revenge, though I knew that's how they would frame it. This was about accountability. My phone had been buzzing constantly while I wrote, but I'd ignored it completely. Now I scrolled through the messages that had accumulated, and they told a story of escalating panic. My father, this has gone too far. Delete whatever you recorded and we'll forget this happened. My mother, you're going to destroy this family over a silly prank. Uncle Bob, your parents are worried sick. Stop being selfish and think about what this will do to everyone else. Katie, I can't believe you're going to ruin my wedding over this. How can you be so vindictive? That last one actually made me laugh out loud. Katie's wedding was still 8 months away, but somehow my refusal to accept humiliation quietly was going to ruin it. The logic was so perfectly representative of my family's mindset that it could have been a case study. I put my phone aside and focused on the next phase of my plan, because documenting what had happened was only the first step. The second step was making sure the right people saw it. I started with an email to my extended family, the aunts and uncles and cousins who'd been hearing my parents' version of family stories for years. The relatives who'd been told I was difficult, ungrateful, too sensitive, unable to appreciate family humor. The people who'd probably been hearing about tonight's dinner plans and how hilarious they were going to be. I attached the recording and my written account, along with a simple message explaining that I wanted them to have the full context of tonight's events before they heard anyone else's version. Then I composed a longer email to my parents' friends, the people who'd been hearing for years about their challenging daughter, who just couldn't seem to get her life together. I explained that they might be hearing some concerning stories about family conflict, and I wanted them to understand what had actually happened. Finally, I drafted a very different kind of message for my own friends and colleagues, people who'd been listening to me make excuses for my family's behavior for years, who'd watched me minimize and rationalize treatment that they'd tried to tell me wasn't normal. By the time I finished, it was almost midnight, and my phone had stopped buzzing. Either my family had given up trying to reach me, or they'd moved on to calling each other to figure out damage control. I sent all the emails, finished my wine, and went to bed with a feeling I hadn't experienced in years. For the first time in my adult life, I felt proud of myself. Not for any external achievement, not for meeting someone else's expectations, but for finally standing up for myself in a way that mattered. Tomorrow, there would be consequences. Phone calls, arguments, probably threats and guilt trips, and every manipulation tactic my family had perfected over the decades. But tonight, I slept better than I had in years, knowing that I was finally done being anyone's victim. The real story was just beginning. Sunday morning brought the sound of my phone ringing at 6:47 a.m. I'd turned off notifications for texts the night before, but calls were still getting through, and apparently my family had decided that early morning panic was their best strategy. I let it go to voicemail. Then I let the next 5 calls go to voicemail too. By the time I finally dragged myself out of bed around 9 a.m., I had 14 missed calls and 47 unread text messages. The progression from demanding to pleading to threatening was almost artistic in its desperation. What do you think is going to happen next? Drop your prediction in the comments and make sure to subscribe for the conclusion of this story. While I was making coffee, my doorbell started ringing, continuous, aggressive ringing that suggested someone was leaning on the button and refusing to let up. I looked through the peephole to see my brother Tommy standing on my doorstep, looking like he hadn't slept. I opened the door but didn't invite him in. "Zara, what the hell have you done?" he said without any preamble. "Mom's been crying all night. Dad's talking about hiring lawyers. Do you have any idea what you've started?" "Good morning to you too, Tommy," I said, taking a sip of my coffee. "Lovely weather we're having." "This isn't funny," he snapped. "Aunt Carol called Mom at 11 last night. Uncle Jim called at midnight. Everyone's seen your recording and now the whole family is in chaos." "Interesting," I said. "And what exactly did Aunt Carol and Uncle Jim have to say about the recording?" Tommy's face shifted uncomfortably. "That's not the point. The point is you're tearing this family apart over a stupid joke." "A stupid joke," I repeated. "Is that what we're calling it?" "Yes, that's what we're calling it, because that's what it was." But his voice lacked conviction, and he wouldn't meet my eyes. "Look, everyone knows you've always been sensitive about family stuff." Sensitive. I set my coffee cup down and looked at my brother. Really looked at him. "Tommy, did you watch the recording?" "Of course I watched it." "The whole thing? The part where everyone's setting up their phones to film my reaction? The part where Mom and Dad are practically vibrating with excitement about hurting me? The part where you all look like you're settling in to watch a show?" His silence was answer enough. "Here's what's interesting about all this concern for family unity," I continued. "For 28 years, you've watched them treat me like garbage, and you've never once been worried about tearing the family apart. You've never called me at 6 in the morning because you were concerned about my feelings. You've never shown up at my door demanding that someone apologize to me. That's different," he said weakly. "How?" "Because," he struggled for a moment, then seemed to give up on finding a logical explanation. "Because now everyone's upset." "Everyone's upset," I said slowly, "meaning everyone except me. Because my feelings have never counted before. So why would they start counting now?" Tommy ran his hands through his hair, looking genuinely distressed. "Zara, I know things haven't always been perfect, but this is going too far. You're going to destroy relationships that can't be repaired." "Good," I said, and the finality in my voice seemed to shock him. "Some relationships should be destroyed." I started to close the door, but Tommy put his hand against it. "Wait," he said. "What do you want? What will it take to fix this?" I stopped and studied his face. "You really want to know what it would take?" "Yes." An acknowledgement that what happened last night wasn't a joke. It was deliberate cruelty planned and executed by people who claim to love me. An apology, not for the cake, but for 30 years of treating me like I don't matter. And consequences, real consequences, for people who think it's acceptable to film someone's humiliation for entertainment. But that's not going to happen. "I know," I said, "which is why we're done here." I closed the door and locked it, leaving Tommy standing on my doorstep. Back inside, I finally looked at my phone. The messages had shifted from demanding to bargaining to threatening in perfect progression. My favorite was from Uncle Bob. "You better fix this mess before it gets out of hand." Out of hand. As if systematically humiliating a family member wasn't already out of hand. As if 30 years of emotional abuse wasn't already out of hand. As if filming someone's pain for entertainment wasn't already so far out of hand that it had crossed into a completely different universe. I was scrolling through the messages when I came across one from my cousin Lisa, Uncle Bob's daughter. Unlike the others, this one was different. "Zara, I watched the recording. I'm so sorry. I had no idea they were planning something like that. What they did was awful and you didn't deserve it. I'm proud of you for standing up for yourself." I stared at that message for a long time. It was the first genuine apology I'd received in 24 hours, and it was from someone who hadn't even been there. Then I noticed something else. Several of the relatives who'd received my email had started calling my parents instead of calling me. The panic in my family's messages suggested that the responses they were getting from extended family weren't quite what they'd expected. Apparently, when people watched adults planning and executing deliberate cruelty against a family member, they didn't find it nearly as amusing as my parents had hoped they would. That's when I realized the evening's events had set off a much bigger chain reaction than anyone had anticipated. This wasn't just about one humiliating dinner anymore. This was about 28 years of behavior that had finally been documented and shared with people who'd only heard one version of the story. And for the first time, it wasn't my version being dismissed as oversensitive. It was my family's version being questioned by people they'd expected to support them. 2 weeks after the dinner, I contacted Victoria Martinez, an attorney specializing in family emotional distress cases. She spent the first week reviewing all the materials I'd sent her, the recording, my written account, and the subsequent messages from my family members. Monday morning of the following week, I finally met with her in person. "Ms. Walsh," she said when I arrived at her downtown office, "I've reviewed everything you sent me. This is quite a situation you're dealing with." Victoria was younger than I'd expected, but had the kind of presence that suggested she'd dealt with difficult cases before. Her office was lined with certificates and awards, but what struck me most was a framed quote on her desk. "The truth will set you free, but first it will make you miserable. I want to be clear about something before we continue," she said, settling back in her chair. "What happened to you was wrong. Full stop. The level of premeditation and the fact that they filmed it for entertainment purposes takes this well beyond normal family conflict." I felt something relax in my chest that I hadn't even realized was tense. Someone with legal training had looked at the evidence and confirmed what I'd known but had been doubting. This wasn't normal. This wasn't acceptable. This wasn't something I should just get over. "However," Victoria continued, "pursuing legal action against family members is complicated. Are you prepared for what that process will look like?" "I think so," I said. "What am I looking at?" "Emotional distress claims can be difficult to prove, but the premeditation and filming work in your favor. The fact that this appears to be part of a long-term pattern of emotional abuse strengthens the case considerably, but your family will fight back, and they won't fight fair." She wasn't wrong. 3 weeks later, I received a visit from a process server delivering a cease and desist letter from my parents' attorney. Apparently, sharing recordings of my own humiliation constituted harassment and defamation, according to their legal team. I forwarded the letter to Victoria, who called me back the next day. "This is exactly what I expected," she said. "They're trying to intimidate you into backing down. The letter is mostly bluster, but it tells us they're taking this seriously enough to hire legal representation. So what do? We file first," she said, "and we file comprehensively." The emotional distress lawsuit we filed the following week was more detailed than I'd expected. Victoria had spent weeks helping me document not just Saturday's dinner, but years of similar incidents that established a pattern of deliberate psychological abuse. The financial damages we requested were significant enough to get attention, but not so large as to seem unreasonable. During the preparation process, we faced one challenge when my parents initially claimed the recording was illegally obtained. But Victoria successfully argued that I had every right to record conversations I was part of, and their motion was denied. More importantly, filing the lawsuit had an immediate effect on my family's behavior. The angry phone calls stopped. The text messages became more careful. Someone had clearly explained to them that anything they said to me now could be used as evidence. But the real impact was on everyone else. My cousin Jennifer called me the Thursday after we filed the lawsuit, her voice shaking. "Zara, I just wanted you to know that after I saw your recording, I started thinking about some things that happened at family gatherings over the years, things I saw but didn't really process at the time." "What kind of things?" "The way they talked about you when you weren't around. The way they planned situations to make you uncomfortable. The way they dismissed your achievements while celebrating everyone else's. I always thought it was just typical family dynamics, but seeing it all laid out like this..." She paused. "I'm ashamed that I never said anything. Jennifer wasn't the only one. Throughout the weeks following the lawsuit filing, I received calls and messages from relatives who were suddenly viewing past family interactions through a different lens. People were remembering comments they'd dismissed, incidents they'd rationalized, patterns they'd never connected before. The most significant call came from my grandmother on Friday afternoon, about a month after the dinner. "Zara, dear," she said, her 84-year-old voice carrying more authority than I'd heard from her in years. "I've seen what your parents did, and I want you to know that I'm ashamed of them." My grandmother had always been the family matriarch, the person whose opinion carried the most weight, whose approval everyone sought. For her to publicly condemn my parents' behavior was seismic. "I've also seen the responses from other family members," she continued, "and I want you to know that not everyone agrees with your parents' version of events. Some of us have been watching this pattern for years and wondering when someone would finally have the courage to address it." "Grandma, you don't need to explain anything to me, dear. What you need to know is that your grandfather and I will not be attending any family gatherings where your parents are present until they make proper amends for their behavior." I sat in stunned silence. My grandparents were the center of all major family celebrations. Thanksgiving, Christmas, Easter, birthday parties, all revolved around their house and their participation. For them to boycott events until my parents apologized was unprecedented. "Furthermore," my grandmother continued, "I've spoken to several other family members who feel the same way. Your parents are going to discover that their behavior has consequences beyond just their relationship with you." After we hung up, I sat in my apartment trying to process what was happening. What had started as me finally standing up for myself had become something much larger. My family's carefully constructed narrative about who was the problem and who was the victim was falling apart under scrutiny from people they'd expected to support them automatically. My phone rang again. This time it was my mother, and her voice was different than I'd ever heard it before. Scared. Uncertain. "Zara," she said carefully, "your father and I think maybe we should all sit down and talk about this situation." "What situation is that, Mom?" There was a long pause. "You know what situation." "No, I really don't. Can you be more specific?" Another pause. "The misunderstanding from Saturday night." "Misunderstanding?" I almost laughed. "Is that what we're calling it now?" "Zara, please. Your grandmother isn't speaking to us. Half the family has canceled plans. Your father's colleagues have seen the recording. This has gotten completely out of control." "Interesting," I said. "And what exactly is out of control about people seeing who you really are?" "That's not fair," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. "You're making us look like monsters over a simple prank." "Mom," I said quietly, "I didn't make you look like anything. I just showed people what you actually did." There was silence on the other end of the line. "The difference between those two things," I continued, "is everything." 6 weeks after the dinner, I was settling into a routine I hadn't experienced since childhood. Peace. My phone wasn't constantly buzzing with family drama. My weekends weren't filled with obligatory gatherings where I'd be the evening's entertainment. My stress levels had dropped so dramatically that I was sleeping through the night for the first time in years. The lawsuit was progressing steadily. My parents' attorney had filed several motions trying to get the case dismissed, all of which had been denied. Discovery was moving forward, which meant my family was being forced to produce evidence and answer questions under oath about their treatment of me over the years. "The beautiful thing about legal discovery," Victoria had explained, "is that it doesn't care about family loyalty or keeping secrets. It only cares about facts." Meanwhile, the social consequences of their behavior were expanding in ways none of us had anticipated. My father's co-workers at the insurance company where he'd worked for 15 years had seen the recording. According to my cousin Mark, who worked in the same industry, my father was facing some uncomfortable conversations and strained relationships with colleagues who were questioning his judgment. My mother's book club had become noticeably uncomfortable around her after several members saw the recording. Her volunteer position at the local animal shelter became tense as other volunteers expressed discomfort with the situation. Most significantly, their social circle was contracting gradually. Friends who'd known them for decades were distancing themselves, not just because of what they'd seen in the recording, but because they were starting to question other behaviors they'd witnessed over the years. I learned about most of these developments through my cousin Lisa, who had become an unexpected ally in all of this. She called me every few days to update me on family developments, and her reports painted a picture of a couple who were finally facing consequences for behavior they'd never been held accountable for. "Your Aunt Margaret tried to defend them at first," Lisa told me during one of our calls. "She kept saying it was just family teasing and that you were overreacting. But then Uncle David reminded her about the time they publicly mocked your college graduation speech, and the time they forgot to invite you to Tommy's surprise party, and the way they always seated you at the kids' table until you were 25. And Aunt Margaret got quiet and hasn't brought it up since." I think people are starting to remember a lot of things they'd previously written off as harmless family dynamics. The isolation my parents were experiencing was largely self-imposed. They could have acknowledged what they'd done, apologized sincerely, and begun the process of making amends. Instead, they'd chosen to double down on their position that I was overreacting and that everyone else was being manipulated by my victim mentality. This strategy was backfiring spectacularly. During this time, I was building a life that felt more authentically mine than anything I'd ever experienced. Without the constant drain of family drama, I had energy for things I'd forgotten I enjoyed. I started taking pottery classes. I joined a hiking group. I began dating again, something I'd avoided for years because I'd been too exhausted from family stress to maintain healthy relationships. Most importantly, I was discovering what it felt like to be around people who genuinely liked and respected me. People who didn't see me as entertainment or as someone who needed constant correction. People who valued my opinions, celebrated my successes, and supported me during difficulties without making me feel grateful for basic human decency. The contrast was so stark that I started to understand just how abnormal my family relationships had been. I'd become so accustomed to being treated poorly that I'd forgotten what normal human interaction felt like. My new hiking group included a woman named Sarah who worked as a therapist. During one of our conversations about family relationships, she made an observation that stayed with me. Healthy families want their members to thrive, she said. They celebrate each other's successes, support each other during failures, and create environments where everyone feels valued and respected. Unhealthy families need someone to be the problem, so everyone else can feel superior by comparison. What happens when the designated problem person leaves? I asked. Usually they try to pull that person back in, and if that doesn't work, they find a new person to fill the role. But sometimes, if enough people leave or set boundaries, the whole system has to change. That conversation helped me understand something important about what was happening with my extended family. For years, they'd enabled my parents' behavior because it didn't directly affect them, and because having me as the family scapegoat meant they weren't at risk of becoming targets themselves. But now that the behavior was documented and public, they had to choose between continuing to enable it or acknowledging that it was wrong. Many of them were choosing acknowledgement, which meant my parents were losing the support system that had allowed their behavior to continue unchecked. 3 months after the dinner, my grandmother called with an update that surprised even me. "Your parents came to see us yesterday," she said. "They wanted us to help them convince you to drop the lawsuit and come to your senses. How did that go?" I told them that the person who needs to come to their senses isn't you. I also told them that if they spent half as much energy examining their own behavior as they've spent trying to control yours, they might actually make some progress. What did they say to that? "Your mother cried. Your father got angry. They accused me of being manipulated by you, which I found quite insulting. Do they really think I'm so simple that I can't watch a recording and understand what I'm seeing?" I could hear the steel in my grandmother's voice, the same tone she'd used when I was a child and needed protection from playground bullies. Except now, she was protecting me from my own parents. "At my age," she continued, "I don't have time for people who refuse to take responsibility for their actions. Life is too short to pretend that cruelty is acceptable just because it comes from family." After we hung up, I realized that my family's response to this crisis had revealed something important. When forced to choose between acknowledging their behavior and losing relationships, they were willing to lose relationships. That choice told me everything I needed to know about how they actually valued me, compared to how they valued being right. 4 months after the dinner, Victoria called with news I'd been both expecting and dreading. "Your parents' attorney has made a settlement offer," she said. "They want to meet in person to discuss terms." "What kind of terms?" "The usual. They'll pay a modest sum in exchange for you signing a non-disclosure agreement and dropping all legal action. No admission of wrongdoing, no public apology, just money to make the problem go away." I wasn't surprised. Throughout this process, my parents had made it clear that they viewed this situation as a public relations problem, rather than a genuine reckoning with their behavior. They wanted to purchase my silence, not address the underlying issues that had led to this point. "What do you think?" I asked. "That depends on what you want to accomplish," Victoria replied. "If you want money and closure, this might be the fastest path. If you want accountability and genuine change, we continue with the lawsuit." I thought about that conversation for 3 days before making my decision. The settlement meeting was held in a sterile conference room at my parents' attorney's office. My parents sat on one side of a long mahogany table, looking older and more worn than I'd ever seen them. Their lawyer, a middle-aged man who specialized in making problems disappear for people with money, sat between them with a folder full of papers designed to erase the previous months from existence. Victoria and I sat across from them, and the contrast in energy was noticeable. While my parents looked like people attending their own funeral, I felt more composed and centered than I had in years. Ms. Walsh, their attorney began, my clients deeply regret that a family misunderstanding has escalated to this level. They're prepared to offer a substantial sum to resolve this matter and allow everyone to move forward. How substantial? Victoria asked. $50,000, he said, sliding a document across the table, in exchange for dismissing all legal claims and agreeing to confidentiality regarding the events of October 14th. I looked at the paper without touching it. $50,000 was more money than I'd ever seen at once, enough to pay off my student loans and put a down payment on a house. It was also significantly less than what we could potentially win at trial, but more importantly, it came with strings attached that I wasn't willing to accept. The confidentiality clause is interesting, I said, looking directly at my parents for the first time since entering the room. It basically says I can never talk about what you did to me, even if you do it again. Zara, my mother said quietly, speaking for the first time since we'd sat down, we just want to put this behind us. We want to be a family again. Do you? I asked. Because nothing about this offer suggests you want to be a better family. It suggests you want to be the same family you've always been, but with a legal agreement ensuring I can't object to it publicly. My father leaned forward. What more do you want from us? We're offering to pay you a significant amount of money. I want you to acknowledge what you did, I said simply. I want you to admit that planning and filming my humiliation wasn't a harmless prank. I want you to apologize for 30 years of treating me like I don't matter. And I want to see evidence that you understand why your behavior was wrong. That's not reasonable, their attorney interjected. My clients aren't admitting any wrongdoing. Then we don't have a deal, I said, standing up. Zara, wait, my mother called as I moved toward the door. Please don't do this. Think about what this will do to the family. I stopped and turned back to face her. I have been thinking about the family. Mom, for 30 years I've been thinking about the family. I've been prioritizing the family's comfort over my own dignity. I've been protecting the family's reputation while you destroyed mine. I've been keeping the family's secrets while you made sure everyone knew mine. My voice was steady, calm, completely controlled. But you know what? I'm done thinking about the family. From now on, I'm thinking about myself. You're being selfish, my father said, his voice rising slightly. Good, I replied. I'm finally being appropriately selfish. It only took me 30 years to learn how. Outside the attorney's office, Victoria and I discussed the next steps. The settlement rejection meant we would proceed to trial, which could take months and would be emotionally exhausting for everyone involved. Are you sure about this? She asked. Trials are unpredictable. You could win more than they offered, but you could also lose everything and end up paying their legal fees. I'm sure, I said. This was never really about money anyway. That evening my phone rang. It was my brother Tommy, and he sounded desperate. Zara, what the hell is wrong with you? Do you know how much $50,000 is? Do you know how many people would kill for that kind of money? Apparently it's how much my parents think my silence is worth, I replied. That's not what this is about and you know it. They're trying to fix things and you're being vindictive. Tommy, I said patiently, if someone punched you in the face and then offered you money to pretend it never happened, would you consider that fixing things? That's completely different. How? There was a long pause. Because this is family. Exactly, I said. This is family, which means it should be better than strangers treating each other badly, not worse. After Tommy hung up, I realized something had fundamentally shifted in how I viewed my relationships with all of them. For the first time in my life, I wasn't trying to maintain connections that required me to accept poor treatment. I wasn't trying to preserve relationships that only worked when I allowed myself to be diminished. I was finally free to be myself, completely and unapologetically, regardless of whether my family could handle it. And if they couldn't handle it, that was their problem, not mine. The relief of that realization was so profound that I actually laughed out loud in my empty apartment. For the first time in my adult life, I was putting myself first, and the sky hadn't fallen. The world hadn't ended. My family's threats about destroying relationships had turned out to be empty, because relationships that required my silence and submission weren't worth preserving anyway. I was free, and it felt incredible. The trial date was set for 6 weeks after the failed settlement meeting, and the weeks leading up to it brought developments I hadn't anticipated. What started as a civil lawsuit about emotional distress had become something much larger as more family members came forward with their own stories about my parents' behavior patterns. Victoria called me on a Tuesday morning with news that changed everything. Zara, I've been contacted by 3 of your relatives who want to provide testimony about incidents they witnessed over the years. Additionally, someone has provided us with recordings of conversations where your parents discussed their plans for the dinner, and their general attitude toward you. Recordings? I was stunned. Who has recordings? Your cousin Jennifer. She recently contacted me after hearing about the lawsuit. Apparently, she's been documenting some family interactions over the past year because she started noticing concerning patterns at gatherings. She had her phone recording during a family barbecue last summer where your parents were discussing plans for your birthday. The recordings Jennifer provided were devastating. Hours of conversations between my parents and other family members where they discussed me with casual cruelty that took my breath away, planning not just the birthday dinner, but years of other incidents designed to bring me down to earth and teach me not to think I'm better than everyone else. From 2 months before the dinner, where my father clearly stated that I needed to be knocked down a few pegs, and that the birthday celebration would be the perfect opportunity to remind her where she stands in this family. But the recording that sealed their fate was one where my mother laughed about how they'd trained me so well to accept whatever we dish out, that they could probably do anything and she'd just take it. When Victoria played these recordings for me, I felt something break inside my chest. Not break in a way that damaged me, but break in a way that finally released me from any lingering guilt or obligation I'd been carrying. This wasn't family dysfunction. This wasn't miscommunication or misunderstanding. This was deliberate, calculated psychological abuse that they'd been planning and executing for years, confident that I would continue to accept it. The recordings change everything, Victoria explained. This is no longer just about one incident. This is about a pattern of deliberate psychological abuse with clear evidence of intent and premeditation. 3 days before the trial, my parents' attorney called to request an emergency meeting. This time, they came to Victoria's office, and the dynamic was completely different. My parents looked exhausted, defeated. Their attorney looked like someone who'd realized his clients had been lying to him about the facts of the case. "Ms. Walsh," he began, "my clients would like to make a substantially revised offer to settle this matter." "How substantially revised?" Victoria asked. $75,000, a public apology, and acknowledgement of wrongdoing. No confidentiality requirements. I looked across the table at my parents, who couldn't meet my eyes. "What changed?" I asked. Their attorney glanced at his clients, then back at me. "They've become aware that you have evidence they weren't expecting. Evidence that proves everything I've been saying for 30 years. Evidence that makes this case very difficult to defend," he admitted. My mother finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Zara, please. We didn't realize how bad it looked from the outside. We thought it was just normal family teasing." "No, you didn't," I said quietly. "The recordings make it very clear that you knew exactly what you were doing and why you were doing it." My father finally looked up. "What do you want from us?" "We're offering you everything you asked for." I thought about that question for a long moment. What did I want from them? For 30 years, I'd wanted them to love me the way parents should love their children. I'd wanted them to be proud of me, to support me, to treat me with basic respect and dignity. I'd wanted them to see my worth and celebrate my successes instead of diminishing them. But sitting in that conference room, looking at two people who'd spent decades systematically destroying my self-worth for their own entertainment, I realized something profound. I didn't want anything from them anymore. I didn't want their love, because they'd proven they weren't capable of genuine love. I didn't want their approval, because their approval was worthless. I didn't want their acceptance, because accepting me would require them to change fundamentally, and they'd proven they preferred to destroy relationships rather than change. "I accept the settlement offer," I told their attorney, "but I have one additional requirement." "What's that?" he asked. "I want the public apology to include an acknowledgement that this behavior was part of a long-term pattern, and I want them to state that anyone who's been treated this way by family members should seek help and support rather than accepting it as normal." My parents looked stricken. "You want us to tell other people to sue their families?" My mother asked. "I want you to tell other people that emotional abuse isn't acceptable just because it comes from family members," I corrected. "I want you to acknowledge that you spent 30 years normalizing behavior that should never be tolerated." The settlement was finalized 2 days later. My parents issued a public statement acknowledging their long-term pattern of emotionally abusive behavior toward our daughter and encouraging anyone experiencing similar treatment to seek support and understand that this behavior is not normal or acceptable, regardless of family relationships. The statement went viral on social media. Within days, I was receiving messages from strangers who'd seen it and recognized similar patterns in their own families, people who'd been told they were too sensitive or needed to learn to take a joke when they objected to cruel treatment from relatives. My story became something I'd never intended it to be, permission for other people to stop accepting unacceptable behavior from family members. But the real victory wasn't the money or the public vindication. The real victory was walking out of that law office, knowing that I would never again accept poor treatment from anyone, family, or otherwise, and that I finally understood my own worth regardless of whether anyone else recognized it. I was free, and I had the legal documentation to prove it. 1 year after the settlement, I was sitting in my new apartment, a spacious place with large windows and a view of the city skyline, when my phone rang. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but something made me answer it anyway. Zara, this is Rebecca Martin. I found your number through your public statement about family abuse. I hope it's okay that I'm calling you directly. Of course, I said, settling into the armchair I'd bought specifically because I loved it, not because it matched anything else, or because someone else approved of it. I wanted to thank you, Rebecca continued, her voice shaking slightly. Your story gave me the courage to leave an abusive situation with my own family. I've been in therapy for 6 months now, and I'm finally starting to understand that the way they treated me wasn't normal. I'd received dozens of similar calls and messages over the past year, people who'd seen my story and recognized their own experiences in it. People who'd thought they were alone in dealing with family members who used love as a weapon and guilt as a control mechanism. I'm so glad you reached out, I told Rebecca. How are you doing now? Better. Not perfect, but better. I moved across the country, changed my phone number, and started over completely. Some days are harder than others, but I'm learning what it feels like to live without constantly walking on eggshells. After we hung up, I reflected on how drastically my life had changed since that October evening when I'd walked into Luigi's restaurant expecting just another round of family humiliation. The lawsuit settlement had provided financial security, but more importantly, it had provided validation. Having my experience acknowledged in legal documents, having my parents publicly admit their behavior was wrong, having evidence that my perception of reality was accurate had been healing in ways I hadn't expected. But the real transformation had been internal. I'd learned to trust my own judgment about what was acceptable and what wasn't. I'd learned to prioritize my own well-being over other people's comfort. I'd learned that being alone was infinitely better than being with people who diminished me. Most surprisingly, I'd learned that I actually liked myself when I wasn't constantly trying to earn approval from people who were determined not to give it. My relationship with my extended family had evolved in interesting ways. My grandparents had become closer to me than they'd ever been when I was trying to maintain peace with my parents. Several cousins had reached out to rebuild connections that didn't require pretending my parents' behavior was acceptable. The family members who truly cared about me had found ways to maintain relationships that honored my boundaries. The relatives who couldn't accept that I was no longer willing to be the family scapegoat had gradually faded from my life, and I discovered that their absence created space for healthier relationships with people who actually valued me. My parents had honored the terms of the settlement by issuing the public apology and paying the damages, but there had been no further contact between us. They'd made no attempt to have genuine conversations about repairing our relationship, which told me everything I needed to know about their priorities. I'd grieved the parents I'd wanted them to be, but I'd stopped grieving the relationship I'd actually had with them. That relationship had been harmful to me, and its absence was a gift, not a loss. My career had flourished without the constant drain of family stress. I'd been promoted twice and was considering starting my own consulting firm. My personal relationships had improved dramatically once I'd learned to recognize red flags and set boundaries. I was dating someone who treated me with genuine respect and kindness, and the contrast with my family experiences had helped me appreciate what healthy relationships actually looked like. Most importantly, I'd learned to be my own advocate. I no longer waited for other people to defend me or validate my experiences. I no longer tried to convince people who were determined to misunderstand me. I no longer accepted crumbs of affection from people who should have been providing genuine love and support. That evening, as I was preparing for bed, I found myself thinking about the moment at Luigi's when I'd said those 3 words that changed everything. I recorded everything. Those words hadn't just exposed my family's behavior, they'd marked the moment when I stopped being a victim and started being the author of my own story. For 30 years, other people had written my narrative. They'd decided who I was, what I was worth, how I should be treated. They'd convinced me that their version of reality was the only valid one, that their assessment of my value was accurate, that their treatment of me was what I deserved. But in that restaurant, surrounded by people who thought they were about to enjoy another round of entertainment at my expense, I'd finally taken control of the narrative. I'd shown them that their version of events only worked when no one else could see what they were really doing. I demonstrated that their power over me was entirely dependent on my willingness to accept it. I'd proven that their assessment of my worth was meaningless compared to my own. The recording I'd made that night had become evidence in a legal case, but it had been something more important than that. proof that I finally understood my own value and was willing to defend it. As I turned off the lights in my apartment, the same apartment my parents had once criticized as too small and in the wrong neighborhood, I felt something I'd never experienced before: complete satisfaction with my own choices. I'd built a life that reflected who I actually was, rather than who other people thought I should be. I'd surrounded myself with people who appreciated me, rather than people who tolerated me. I'd created a space where I could be entirely myself without fear of judgment or punishment. The birthday dinner that was supposed to be my final humiliation had instead become the moment of my liberation. And unlike the family jokes at my expense, this victory would never get old. If this story resonated with you, make sure to like and subscribe for more stories about finding the courage to stand up for yourself, even when it means standing alone. Sometimes the family we choose is healthier than the family we're born into, and sometimes walking away is the strongest thing you can do. Remember, you don't owe anyone access to your life, especially people who use that access to hurt you. Your peace is worth more than their approval, and you deserve relationships that add to your life instead of subtracting from it. Where are you in your own journey of setting boundaries with difficult family members? Share your story in the comments below. You might be surprised how many people understand exactly what you're going through. Actually, let me be completely honest with you for a moment. As I sit here in my peaceful apartment, glass of wine in hand, looking out at the city lights, I can't help but smile when I think about that cake. Congratulations on another year of being pathetic. Well, Mom and Dad, congratulations on another year of being exactly who I always knew you were. The only difference is now everyone else knows it too. And you know what? That feels pretty fantastic.